Good morning. Welcome to the Arvada Center for the Arts and Humanities. My name is Philip Sneed, and I'm honored to serve here as the Executive Director. And I'm sure we have many in the audience today who were at the panel last night, so I won't bother you with my entire remarks, but for those who are new, I would like to beg your indulgence while I just repeat a very short section of what I said last night to set the stage for those who might be new today, and then I'll turn the panel over to our moderator and panelists. 25 years ago yesterday, more than 70 armed FBI agents, along with agents of the Environmental Protection Agency, staged a raid on the Rocky Flats plant to search for evidence of environmental crimes. It has been said that this was the only time in U.S. history when the federal government raided itself. How did we get to the point where apparently the only course of action was for the federal government to approve an armed raid on one of its agencies, the Department of Energy, by two of its other agencies, the FBI and the EPA? Was there really no other option but to essentially point the guns at ourselves? Throughout this weekend, you will hear many different points of view about the raid and about its aftermath. And as you listen to these discussions, I hope you'll consider some of the more pressing questions which Rocky Flats raises even today. For example, how much secrecy do we need in order to provide for the national defense? What is the role of whistleblowers in a democratic society? Were the whistleblowers at Rocky Flats any different from Edward Snowden today? Is there a limit to how much we should spend to keep the air and water safe? How much more are you willing to pay in taxes to ensure a clean environment? How clean is clean enough? Is civil disobedience an effective means to achieve political change? What about Leroy Moore's 24-day hunger strike? How much can we trust our own government? And if we can't believe our public health agencies, who can we believe? And lastly, what is the role of artists in helping to effect change? Does their work make any difference at all? I'm certain that other questions will arise today and over the course of the weekend, and I'm equally certain that we can debate these questions with civility and respect. In closing, I would like to invite you all to visit the exhibit downstairs in our History Museum, Rocky Flats in History, Art, and Memory. This collection of art and artifacts provides a multifaceted look at the history of Rocky Flats and its impact on the local, regional, national, and global community. I would also like to mention that if you enjoy the exhibition, you consider supporting the Rocky Flats Institute and Museum. We are in danger of losing this organization, and they need your support. They have a table out front. You can certainly ask them questions. Many of the board members and volunteers at the museum are former workers at the Rocky Flats plant. You can meet some of them here today, so please consider supporting that excellent organization. I would also like to thank our primary sponsor, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and John and Carol Balcom, without whose support this event would not have been possible. I would also like to thank our partners, the Rocky Flats Institute and Museum and the Center of the American West at CU Boulder. Credit is also due to Carnegie Library's Maria Rogers Oral History Program in Boulder, and additional advice and support was provided by History Colorado and Colorado Humanities. The Arvada Center for the Arts and Humanities enjoys generous support from the City of Arvada and from the citizens of the Scientific and Cultural Facilities District. Lastly, I would like to thank the staff of the Arvada Center, as well as all of the other artists and panelists and their institutions. Many people have contributed time and talent and travel to make this event possible, and we're deeply grateful to you all. I will now turn the program over to our moderator, Patty Limerick, who is the faculty director and chair of the board of the Center of the American West at CU Boulder. Patty Limerick.
Thank you. I am going to start with a boring statement, which is probably the only boring statement that we'll have in these 2 hours. The boring statement is that we will have lunch in disparate, scattered places. So at noon, you will go elsewhere for lunches, and then you will come back here at 1 o'clock for the next session. That's a useful statement, but it is, there's no emotion in it really, which is just that. Although, well, I mean, hunger, that's right, hunger is an issue, that could be a fact. So, I would like to tell you about our format today. We will have 10-minute opening statements from each of our speakers. They will frame those statements around the question of how their lives became connected with, or I suppose you'd have to say intertwined with, the history of Rocky Flats. They will tell you what they knew about the raid before it happened, which for our first two speakers will be a very brief remark that they knew nothing about the raid. In fact, I've given their remarks on that, since they were not told about the raid beforehand. So they will tell you how they learned of the raid and what their reactions were. I am in a seat here that, if this were an experiment in physics, there's the absence of knowledge that the raid was coming. They did not know that the raid was coming, and I am sitting next to the person who organized the raid. And if I were a physics experiment, phew, I would just go, because what a thing to have those. So I have done you a public service by doing my best to hold these people back. We met for a few minutes beforehand, and the conversation was so interesting that I threw myself in the path of it so that you can hear them have that conversation with that first time ever. Because, I mean, as an historian, I am overcome by the fact these three people have never met before today. Oh, no. Three, I would accent the word three. Yes, of course, Congressman Skaggs and the governor of Colorado, yes, they did have a get-together a time or two, I would imagine, or several thousand times. So, sorry. But in terms of the conversation, the three-way conversation, that is happening for the first time. I'm sorry, that was a preposterous remark. I apologize for that. That'll be my last preposterous remark, I hope. So, so those opening 10-minute statements, and I will be a little rude there in asking them to stop at 10 minutes so that we can then get the dynamic between these three experiences going. We will have a follow-up discussion among the panelists for a spell, and we will then shift to audience question and answer. And because of the extreme historical value of having these three figures with us, and I should say I'm very aware that I am looking at historic figures in this room as well, that we didn't corner the market on historical figures up here, but we did pretty well, I will say that. We did quite well, but there's plenty of other people whose stories are of great importance as well. But I'm going to ask at this session for very brief questions so that we can make as much of this company as we have. And if I flub, if I leave out something that was crucially important, and I will be here today and tomorrow, and I will make sure that if you stop me and tell me the stupid omission I made, I will make sure that that omission gets addressed in some way. So, okay, so that is our format, and then I'm going to reserve the last 10 minutes or so, so each of them can make a concluding 2 or 3 minute talk. Okay, now, I believe I've said everything I needed to say there. We're going in reverse alphabetical order, as I have told them. The only thing that brings order to my life is alphabetical order. So we're going to do that, but it also gives us the dynamic of building up, I would assume, enormous curiosity about what was going on that led to that event in June 6th. But I would like to say it is also the case that I think a number of us up here see June 6, 1989 as an important moment, a striking moment, but one among many important events and activities. And so their remarks about their relationship with Rocky Flats don't need to focus on anticipating June 6th. It's what was it to be the congressman from the 2nd District and to have Rocky Flats in that district? What was it to be the governor of Colorado and to have Rocky Flats there? I may interrupt if you're referring to something that I think the audience might need a little bit more clarification of what event or memo you're talking about. So I shall now begin with Congressman David Skaggs, who has a distinguished career as an attorney. He was in the Marines. He was initially in the Colorado House of Representatives. He then represented Congressional District 2 from 1987 to 1999. In the Congress, we need him back there because he was a voice for civility, and he really tried to get those guys to behave like grown-ups. That's not the way you would put it, I don't think, but it was a wonderful service that he did in Congress of trying to bring out this is a better way of putting it, forget the grown-up thing, trying to bring out the better angels of their nature in Congress. So that's still a good cause. He is an attorney now at McKenna, Long, and Aldridge, and he will be our first speaker.
Thank you very much, Patty. Thanks, everybody, for being here this morning. Patty's instructions to us really are, I guess, an invitation to a reminiscence of sorts. Normally, I think of opening statements as being full of policy kinds of things at an occasion like this, but I think it's going to be more our recollections of what our lives were like during this period of time. For me, a good deal of sort of poignance and irony and still anxiety as I think about the relatively minor role I played in the Rocky Flats saga during the years that I had a connection with it. Those began for me when I was invited by then Congressman-elect Tim Wirth to go to Washington with him after the election of 1974. And I happily and perhaps naively agreed to do that and left law practice in Boulder to go back and be Tim's then called AA, now would be with title inflation chief of staff. But immediately became involved with already the issues surrounding Rocky Flats as I staffed Tim on those. The days that quickly became the Lamworth Task Force that was put together maybe in '75. Federico Pena was very involved in, as one of the members of that task force, I think the first kind of intergovernmental state-federal effort to scope out what the issues at the Platts were, what was fact, what was hyperbole, what we really needed to be worried about, what we could do about what we needed to be worried about. Many questions, few answers during that period of time, but really my first total immersion in Rocky Flatsness. I stayed with Tim for a couple of years, came back, went back to practicing law, and decided in 1980 to run for the state legislature. And in a Boulder district that, as you might suspect, was much more concerned with the environmental and public health implications of the presence of the plant just south of town. There were plant workers that lived in Boulder, but the overwhelming political dynamic relative to the plant, as I entered politics myself, was, somewhere between let's close it and take, extremely drastic steps to contain its public health and environmental dangers, which were, well-founded concerns, no doubt. At the time, I hadn't lived in Colorado at the time of the big fire in '69, so I didn't have the benefit of that firsthand experience. What I ended up doing to try to address, and I hoped a significant way, some of the issues that came out of the plant that were pertinent to the office I hoped to hold in the state legislature had to do with workers' comp issues. And so got to work early on with some of the stalwart members of Local 8031 of the United Steelworkers of America, who were the organization for most of the workers at the plant. Jerry Harden. Jerry, are you in the audience now, or are you still out front with the banner? Anyway, and we developed a piece of legislation that would have changed the presumption about radiation-caused illnesses, mainly for the benefit of workers at the plant that had had significant lifetime exposures to ionizing radiation, and were faced with the impossible task under the then existing workers' comp laws to have to demonstrate conclusively cause and effect, whereas these were conditions that arose over a long time, didn't manifest themselves for a long time thereafter. The bill I introduced in 1981 was, as we use the terminology of the legislature, PI'd, killed, relatively mercilessly. But I mention that because, fast forward really to announcements just a few months ago that finally the Department of Energy is recognizing the necessity of that kind of a presumptive connection, so that the task of demonstrating cause and effect between exposure to bad stuff at the plant and latent disease is now established. Not an easy task still for the workers to get through to a appropriate conclusion that they are deserving of those benefits. Fast forward again, Tim Wirth decides to run for the Senate after Gary Hart decides not to run for re-election, and I decide to run for Tim's, what I think of as Tim's seat in Congress. It's your seat in Congress. Struggled through a very tough campaign, sort of a come-from-behind squeaker. That first year, 86, won with less than 50% of the vote against Mike Norton, and a moment more mention of Mike. But election night, I got a nice telephone call from Tim congratulating me on being elected to the U.S. House. His second comment after congratulations was, "David, now Rocky Flats is yours." Which, of course, was a little glib, not that Tim was ever glib, but was exemplified how central in his time as a member of Congress dealing with the issues surrounding the plant had been, and a valid prediction on his part how central they would be in my 12 years. Spring of 1989, my office on June 6th was busy, not with Rocky Flats that day, but with organizing a march by members of the U.S. House of Representatives from the Capitol to the Chinese embassy to protest what had happened at Tiananmen. That was what was on my mind on June 6th, following the awful events of June 4th. We took that march. I have a rain-spattered sign in my office now that my kids carried on that march in front of 40 or 50 members of the House. But the raid and the news of the raid, which broke in the papers the next day, I knew nothing about in advance. And it really was obviously of great significance, but in a sense of a piece with a whole history over the preceding decade or more in my life, and another marker in a decade to follow of different significant events having to do with the management of the plant, dealing with the questions of violations of federal environmental law, geopolitical questions of the necessity for continuing to build nuclear weapons. If there was such a necessity, how do we do it in a way that is consistent with our concerns for the public's interests in environmental well-being and their own health. One of the confounding things for me as a member of Congress in those days was trying to get at the underlying premise for the continued operation of the plant, that is, the need for additional nuclear warheads, if my memory serves me, particularly the W-88s, needed for the next generation of missiles in our missile-firing submarines. So I tried to get the Department of Defense, that was the custodian of the targeting lists, to let me know, exactly, what were the proposed deployments of those weapons in the god-awful event that we needed to use them, and sort of back out from that some justification for the number of warheads we needed to have and therefore needed to continue to produce. That's just a little example of my own bumping up against immovable government secrecy issues. I was not ever permitted to get at that information, even though as a member of Congress, sort of ex officio, I enjoyed all of the requisite security clearances. Later spent 6 years on the House Intelligence Committee, where I perhaps could have gotten at that information, but by then we were really headed toward closure of the plant. And a word about that, a few I forget exactly how long after the raid, but that was kind of the outcomes from the raid presented the evidence that was finally sufficiently conclusive in my mind that the plant should be closed. I believe I was the first elected official in the state to call for the closure of the plant, and at the same time recognize the implications that had for loyal and patriotic workforce and the need for the country to take care of the transition of those persons who had worked at the plant for years and years and years, exposed themselves to these dangers, needed all of the assistance and support the country could give them, and moving on to the next career in their lives, if there was to be one, or appropriate treatment into retirement, if that were the case. A little bit dicey, I would say, for a member of Congress to call for the closure of the largest employer in his district, but it seemed to me like the right thing to do at the time.
Thank you. Yes, really. That was great. Our next speaker is former Governor Roy Romer, whose parents had him born in Kansas, which I regret, personally. I just think you're such a Coloradan, and you were raised in Holly, and so I understand they made up for it as fast as they could, but still, that's just a little bit of an anomaly there. He held many offices in state government. He was in the Air Force. He became governor. He was elected 3 times. He is the last governor to have 3 terms, elected in 1986, 1990, and 1994. When he was governor at the West, this is a sort of an interesting moment in federal-state relations, I think. I don't know what the secretaries of the Interior always think about governors, but I think there's an occasional line of tension there. So I was at the Western Governors Association, I think in 1990, and I had the company of former Secretary of the Interior, Stuart Udall, through a lot of that. And we heard the governor speak. And Stuart has passed away, and I'm violating his confidence, but he said, after he heard a bunch of the governor, I might have heard him all at that point, he said, "That Romer, that's the smart one." Stuart, am I through yet? No, I'm not quite through. Am I through? So he's gone on. He became the superintendent of schools in Los Angeles, which was, I'm sure, so restful as an experience to be in that situation, a kind of early retirement project. And now, in, quote, retirement, he is quite an advocate for education in many, many different arenas. So, Governor Roy Romer.
I feel humble about this conversation because all of us in public life and private life make a lot of decisions that are sometimes wrong, and you know that. And you still have to call your shots as you see them, and I'm not apologetic for the life of decisions I made, but when you're in a position of reviewing them, you approach it with humility because, man, there's a lot of times I differ with what I thought then. I had, the FBI raid's not my big deal. If you asked me to remember Rocky Flats, the FBI raid would be down 6 or 7 in my memory. I don't mean to slight this conversation, but it's a fact. I didn't pay that much of attention to it, but there were some events that were really significant. I was in a shower Sunday morning, 10 o'clock in the morning, Anschutz.
Andrews. Cecil Andrews.
No, Anschutz. What's his
Oh,
first?
Phil Andrews. Phil Andrews.
Phil,
I'm sorry.
Phil.
I know Cecil Andrews is coming
He's
into
a
the
friend
story.
of mine, and he called me personally out of the shower and said the following: Roy, I got 3 boxcars down here that Cecil Andrews refused to accept in Idaho. What do you want me to do with them? They're full of atomic waste. I said, wow. I asked him to describe the boxcars, how heavy they were. I said, haul them back to Rocky Flats and we'll talk later. I called Cecil Andrews and he said, look, you're not going to put any more of that waste in my state. I recognized I had a problem immediately because that plant is jurisdiction. I wasn't in charge of what happened within it. It was the federal government. I was in charge of how much waste you can deposit in Colorado. So Monday morning, I went into my office and talked to my staff, and I said, get me out to that plant, because we cannot become the dump of last resort for atomic waste. And I went out, and they kept this waste in metal barrels, 55-gallon drums. And I said, count with me the number of drums, and it was 1,601. I had to get John to help me remember that number. And I put out an order, executive order, there shall not be more than 1,601 drums of waste in this state, period. I could do that. I couldn't do anything else about closing the plant, but I could do that. That began the whole rough and tumble about WIP, you know, and I finally got the count of
You might say what that,
WIP, what is WIP?
Waste Isolation Pilot Project?
Say it again?
Waste Isolation Pilot Project.
Down in the salt mines in New Mexico. Eventually it cost $7 billion plus. And often I'd wake up in the night and said, God, Romer, you caused the expenditure of that, you know. But that was a very significant involvement in that plant. I was governor in 87 to 98. So this was in, you know, I can't even remember the date. Can anybody here at the panel give me the date when we shut down the waste?
87?
No, I was governor 87 to 98.
But it was before the raid. Len, do you happen to recall? I mean, I know
Well, I was
that Cecil
elected in
Anderson-
1986.
Yeah, okay, sorry, we're,
Whatever.
historian,
But here, that's one event that was very vivid, and I followed then the, what are we going to do with the waste when WIP is built, how are we going to transport it? I remember going through a great deal of time how we could do that safely. But I considered my responsibility to be sure that waste didn't accumulate, and the general responsibility of the plant being safe, like we had the arsenal out to the east. It's not a similar problem, but another problem. That's the first incident I want to talk to you about. The second one is one that I have never discussed publicly. First day is today. Before the FBI raid, there was an overflight by the FBI of a certain chimney. It was about 6 months, maybe, some months before the FBI raid. And the report was that chimney, the FBI claimed publicly, that chimney had been burning at night. And that's part of what led, I think, eventually to the raid. That was serious. I came to the office that morning and said to my staff, take me to the plant. I want to see that furnace, because that was really serious if that furnace was burning at midnight illegally. And I went out just personally, and I'm a kind of a guy that manages by walking around. And I looked at the furnace. I remember its size. It's like it was about the size of a small refrigerator. And then I began to inquire of the people in the plant, how many people have to be in the loop when this furnace burns? And the number was above 30. And I concluded, after all these conversations, that furnace did not burn. It could not have burned without a number of people in that plant reporting it or knowing about it. Just a personal conclusion I reached. I went back to my office, sat down with certain key advisors and said, I don't have any evidence, but my strong instinct is that there has been a mistake here. This furnace, I don't think, ever burned. And we were having a big deal out of this, but I had no evidence. So I didn't go public. There was no sense of my Governor Romer saying, hey, I think the FBI's wrong here. I kept quiet about that, didn't discuss it publicly, until about 15 years later, I saw a blip in the newspaper. And the small story, paragraph or two, said, FBI announces that the film they used on that raid was faulty and that the furnace did not burn. I didn't say anything then. You know, it was just one incident in the life of this that I'll share with you now. Third point I want to make. What does all this say to me? I have to put this into a larger global reaction. I'm a member of the military. I was in the Air Force. And when I became governor, I knew this was a plant that had been located in the wrong place. 96% of the world's plutonium was located 15, 16 miles from Denver. It was crazy. But that's where we were. And so I, like David, thought about how many of these weapons do we have to have? And I have been nervous about that. I think about it all the time, particularly in Ukraine. In the last 30 days, I've been thinking, what keeps us from using these damn bombs again? It's a devastating trigger the world has, and I was fearful that these guys in Eastern Ukraine were going to trigger it. I mean, this is just very personal with me about, I'm part of this history. I helped defend the existence of this plant. I didn't call for it to be closed down. I was different than David. I'm not proud of that, I just didn't. But as I now reflect upon Chernobyl, what happened in Japan, and my belief that science is going to take us, and public policy is going to take us some places we don't like but can't avoid, I think we are where we are. And so I look at Rocky Flats at the time as governor saying, man, I wouldn't have put that there. I wouldn't have started this, but it's now there. This nation's dependent upon it. I need to try to help it finish its job until we get it moved. And that was my role and reaction as governor. I want to finish, though, with this is an unsolved problem. I don't know how to reconcile. My wife and I have 22 grandchildren. How do you live in a world in which is there enough wisdom to keep us from using these weapons and the proliferation of them? It's a very deep worry, and I hope, it's a fact we've already got this history unfolding, but I hope that we can keep our collective senses to help be rational about it as we go forward. That's my comment.
Our third speaker is Jon Lipsky, who has a most interesting career history. He worked for a while at the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, which must give astounding glimpses of human nature to be a policeman in Las Vegas. He worked at the FBI for many years. He retired from the FBI in 2004 as a supervisory special agent. When he was with the FBI, he was stationed for a time in Los Angeles with some very challenging situations of violence he was taking on there. And he also, of course, was at the Denver field office, where his attention was drawn to Rocky Flats. On June 6, 1989, he led the raid that we are reflecting on at this session and this weekend. He has a daughter who is a breakout country western singer. Rachel, is that?
That's correct.
Rachel Lipsky. So Google Rachel Lipsky. Pardon? And what is her last name?
The song is Bones.
The song is Bones, okay. And this is really one of the great, I mean, these people are so historically significant, and then just to be in touch with him as we were communicating about this panel, and to then find that I am on the cutting edge of a new country western phenomenon. That is an unexpected but welcomed side effect of all this. So now we'll hear from the person who knew the things that, some of which you may learn today, actually. Possible. So, but you have known about for quite a while. So anyway, here we go.
Thank you, Patty. Thank you, everybody, for being here. It's a wonderful, wonderful venue. I was the search warrant affiant for the Rocky Flats search warrant application and affidavit. I was 35 years old. I was a first office agent here in Denver. I was your neighbor. And when I became intertwined with Rocky Flats was in May of 1987. And that was really my reality check, because I was provided with a copy of the Mary L. Walker briefing memo. And it was reported in the Rocky Mountain News, RIP. But I got a physical copy in May, and it was over the top in allegations. It was the type of predication that was necessary for a facility like this to get past the political arena. And speaking of which, I had no political agenda. I had no hidden agenda, and I didn't have a religious conviction. I was doing my job. I was protecting and securing the U.S. Constitution. Mariel Walker briefing memo, and I'm going to call it the Walker memo, essentially stated basically no RCRA groundwater monitoring wells. RCRA is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. And that was the predication that began a joint federal investigation of environmental crimes at the Rocky Flats nuclear weapons plant, because that's what it was a nuclear weapons plant. And on June 6, 1989, after signing the affidavit before Magistrate Hilbert Schauer, started a journey of historic, necessary, and important things. The historical significance of the raid was the government abuse. The Walker memo, like I said, was over the top. One of the quotes out of the memo was that some waste facilities there are patently illegal. Environmental contamination at Rocky Flats, a significant problem. Again, this was written by a DOE attorney for DOE folks. It was given to Congress, and thank goodness we have congressional investigations, and it became public. The extent of criminal behavior took a little bit of effort. We had to find out whether the facility, Rocky Flats, was exempt or not, because the provision of the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act allows the President of the United States to exempt a facility. It was not. Also, it was indicia that it wasn't, because the health department was, the Colorado Health Department and the EPA both were pursuing administrative and civil remedies. Another aspect of the memo was that the permit applications that Rocky Flats filed under penalty of perjury were grossly deficient. DOE and contractors certified in 1985, for example, 2 RCRA quality wells, that's groundwater wells, that the Government Accounting Office found were proposed for future RCRA compliance, which you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to certify that you're going to do it in the future. You're certifying to what you're doing right now. The necessity of this was to shed light upon the practices of the DOE and its predecessor agencies, which was the Atomic Energy Commission and IRTA. Changed their name a lot. And I still think about Patricia Schroeder when she wanted to get rid of the Department of Energy. Some of the practices were against people. For instance, Ed Martell. DOE didn't like that Ed Martell found that the 69 fire contaminated the surrounding area. Harvey Nichols, professor at CU, was hired, and because the Department of Energy didn't like his results about particulates of plutonium in the air coming down with snow, they discounted him. And I'm not sure if Ed Martell was treated worse or Dr. Carl Johnson, the former health department official at Jeffco, who was run out of his job. So no good deed goes unpunished. Another aspect of the Walker memo was that the Department of Energy was not dealing openly and candidly with state regulators. And there's no reason to believe they're not doing it now. People had to, historically take on the Department of Energy, and one such person was Charlie McKay. He was here last night. And in the 70s, his uncle and him, because their property was basically condemned or under threat of condemnation, the Department of Energy was going to take their property from them, so they had to sell it for a very low price. And because of some issues about contamination of plutonium, there was a lawsuit. It was made secret by the court, and excuse me, and also the case is under seal. I just called maybe like a year ago to the federal district court clerk's office, and they said that was not an open file. I couldn't look at it because I was with the public. But another aspect of the Walker memo was that the strategy that's outlined in that 7-page document is how the state of Colorado is to come into compliance with DOE. Let me repeat that. The whole object of the Department of Energy was to get Colorado to come in compliance with the DOE. In other words, DOE was suspending the Constitution. The contractor at the facility, as Jack Weaver said last night, it was a GOCO situation. It was a federally owned land facility. It was owned by the Department of Energy. It was contract operated by various contractors at the site. During the raid, it was Rockwell International. And Rockwell had a cost plus award fee contract. They were indemnified, which meant that even if the state of Colorado were to utilize their criminal laws, not only would we, the taxpayers, repay Rockwell for that expense, but they would also make a percentage. And because they had a award fee, their production is considered master over safety. So their award fees were in addition to their profit margin on the contract. It was important because under the rules of national security, Rocky Flats workers were subjected to illness and death. And it's a travesty. At one point, one of the managers at Rocky Flats, the manager, wrote in his diary that Building 771 in October of 1988, it's getting worse and should be shut down. The community was misinformed, to say the least. It's interesting that Rocky Flats was a national priority listed site under Superfund in 1984, and that was under the exclusive jurisdiction of the EPA. There was no further action on that until later. February of 1989, Sierra Club citizen lawsuit was initiated regarding the Building 771 incinerator. That was one of the worrisome aspects of DOE's concerns in the Walker memo, that they didn't want citizen suits to become available. Remember the city of Broomfield? I know it's a county now, but remember the city of Broomfield's diversion ditch of Walnut Creek during the raid? And the EPA went after them? Where was going to find them? There were 4 reactors at Rocky Flats, and those reactors gave off gamma. And those reactors produced materials that were put back into the production lines, and that building was imploded and buried out at the site eventually. There were experiments out at the site. These are things that people have denied for years. Today is the 25th anniversary of the Colorado Health Department's enforcement action at Rocky Flats, because the next day, on June 7th, 1989, the Health Department came out and pursued an enforcement action, and it netted $93,000. But the real golden egg was on June 17th of 1989, when the Colorado Health Department finally negotiated their oversight agreement, and DOE committed $1.8 million for this oversight. And then July 6, 1989, the Health Department obtained full-time presence at Rocky Flats. No more blindfolds, appointments, things like that. In 1989, after the raid, Rocky Flats ceased operations in November 1989 for environmental and safety concerns. That's well documented. It was inconvenient for the Rocky Flats workers, who are really, truly being suppressed right now from their compensation. It was also inconvenient for the U.S. nuclear weapons complex and the W-88 program. A lot of people have said that everything was waning in 1989, and that's hogwash. The W-88 program was a smaller weapon for the Trident II 5D, and this was extremely inconvenient, and my hat's off to Admiral Watkins. He knew this was all coming down. He knew what the implications were. There was a mad scramble to get Lawrence Livermore and Los Alamos and some other facilities to pick up the W-88 program that was just coming into effect. So this was not a winding down situation for Rocky Flats at all. It was a mess out there. The EPA designated the Rocky Flats site as a national priority listed under Superfund site, and it still is today. And it's surrounded by a proposed recreation area. Rockwell International was replaced. Some people say December 16th. I was told by DOE officials that they were short-lived. It was in September I was told they were going to be replaced, of '89. One of the reasons that isn't well discussed is the technical safety appraisals that were conducted at the plant. The last one I read was in '88, but there were some other ones before that. In 1988, there were 85 findings, and if you've ever been around accounting or audits and things, a finding is not good. Schedule F is a terrible thing to deal with. But when 39 of those findings were repeat offenses, Rockwell didn't get it. And I think Admiral Watkins took that into account. He's not here with us anymore, but the man was very intelligent, he was well educated as well, and he knew what he was doing. And there was a lot of things that he was aware of that is just now coming into focus. The contractor reimbursements for fines, January 25th, 1990, DOE renegotiated all the contracts because of the Rocky Flats case. They were removing the elements of reimbursements for fines, attorney fees, administrative costs, defense or of criminal, civil, administrative fines, penalties, and fees. It goes on and on. But another aspect of Rocky Flats that is not very well discussed is we talk about plutonium and uranium and all that stuff. What about the isotope? And in the closure document, it was pointed out that beryllium and plutonium-239 is the isotope, was not only a product at Rocky Flats, but it was also a waste. So what is plutonium-239? Thank you. I'm running out of time. And I couldn't negotiate getting the extra time that the other panelists. But it's really important to understand that plutonium-239 is not just a metal, and it's not to be compared with gold or silver. It's the most toxic substance on the planet. It's lethal in extremely small doses. It's carcinogenic, and it's mutant-causing, meaning it doesn't always show up in the first generation. The half-life, according to evidence-based and scholarly science, is 24,164 years. What that means is that the risk analysis for plutonium-239 is 250,000 years or longer from the biosphere. Over 1,000 different types of dangerous chemicals, some carcinogenic, were at Rocky Flats, and Rocky Flats was anything but a machine shop. I'm probably running out of time.
We'll shift to just asking you questions about things you want to talk about. I am not wanting in any way to silence this important speaker,
no.
but I think if we shift a little bit to the question format, so if you want to just wrap up the statement, and then we'll get you back in a second.
I would just like to point out that for the workers, they're our neighbors too. And in 1990, there was a memorandum of understanding negotiated with Health and Human Services. Little known, it's classified, but it's now coming out that with NIOSH being involved, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health that's working on the Compensation Act, they couldn't deal with some of the stuff that Department of Energy provided in this MOU because it was classified, and science can't work around classification. So it's almost, why did they do this? In 1996, a DOE manager wrote a memo that there would be a moratorium on the destruction of documents at Rocky Flats. And what did that mean? How long had they been doing the destruction? What was destroyed? And how long before they would continue to destroy? That's affecting workers and neighbors alike. We don't know the answer to that question yet. And I think the denouement is on September 16th, 1999, Secretary of Energy Bill Richardson went to Paducah, Kentucky, and apologized to the workers. He said he was sorry because the government was not straight with workers. And you think about it, you go into a fight with a gun or whatever, usually you know that you're going to fight with another gun or a knife or whatever. These workers they're Cold War veterans, were subjected to chemicals and situations that they were lied to about it. So when I hear about the terrible debacle with the Veterans Administration, I've looked into the claim process with the workers, and it's terrible. So you get a chance to see Jerry or Jeff out front holding the Justice for Rocky Flats workers. let them know you care, whatever you can do. Because for me, it's been since May of 1987, and I'm still fighting the fight June 2014.
So I would like to have the opening panel discussion, really in lots of ways. I'll ask one quick question, but then have it driven by things that you would like to know. So if you have things that you have him here, so if you want to be the oral historians in a minute here and ask questions, but may I just ask the starting question of why didn't you tell them before the raid?
The question is, why didn't I tell the governor?
And the congressman.
And the congressman. A little bit of a backstory. Like I said, I was 35 years old. I wasn't even a journeyman agent yet. I was low on the totem pole. But the environmental crime assignment that I had thrusted upon me in November of 1984 still did not give me the credibility, or not credibility, but I would have broke protocol if I had gone past my special agent in charge and the U.S. attorney to talk to these gentlemen. And there was a period of time, probably the January to June of 1989, that we were ramping up to get ready. It wasn't something you could do overnight. And at one point, I did talk to the U.S. attorney and asked him, why don't you go to the leaders that were in position and let them know? And the reason I said that is that in most public corruption cases involving the FBI, a representative that's executive management goes to the leadership and tells the local or county leader or state leadership that we're usually investigating a political corruption crime. And why can't we do it in this case? And all I could do is deliver the message to somebody who I didn't feel like I was taking advantage of them because I had their ear. You have to be careful with protocol sometimes, but I did recommend that, and it was not done. Governor Romer was briefed, I believe, at 10 o'clock on Tuesday, June 6, 1989, by the U.S. attorney, and I have no idea, but now I have a better understanding of Congressman Skaggs' situation, and he was in D.C., so that's the answer. More than you might want to know, but it's the truth.
So, John, was the U.S. attorney then Mike Norton?
The U.S. attorney was Mike Norton.
So that I mentioned in my remarks of the sort of the closing of political loops, and so Mike, who had been my Republican opponent in 1986, was then appointed U.S. attorney.
Exactly.
And Mike and I ended up being allied, if you will, in the dispute that followed the raid, really the dispute that followed the grand jury that followed the raid. And I'm just wondering if you could, assuming you were involved in the grand jury proceedings, talk a little bit about how that came down.
Thanks. Actually, it's a special federal grand jury along the lines of the Watergate special federal grand jury, and it's pretty well detailed in the rules of federal criminal procedure. But I had asked Mike Norton to delay any type of grand jury until at least January of 1990. We just walked out with 1 million pages of documents from Rocky Flats and scores of interviews, and there was quite a bit of things I needed to do because this was 1989. We didn't have a lot of computers, but I did build, with the help of an EPA person, a network system that we could start cataloging and reviewing all the documents. But the case got out of hand quickly, and when we talk about it being in the paper, the search warrant affidavit was sealed, but the Attorney General of the United States, who was Richard Thornburg, I'll speak up, Attorney General Richard Thornburg ordered Mike Norton to unseal the affidavit, which is unprecedented, and it was out of character for my safety and the team that I had of almost 120 people. And in that same month in June, an official from the Department of Justice initiated the special federal grand jury. And looking back now, because I wasn't aware of it, I think the reason for the special federal grand jury was to keep a seal on the records that we had acquired. And that's another aspect of it was in November of 1989, the papers reported that both Congressman Skaggs and Governor Romer had officially talked to Justice Department people that the incinerator didn't happen. And that was very appalling to me. I was very upset because that's a violation of the Rule 6E, dissemination of grand jury information, for which I keep to myself and I can't tell everybody because I would be in contempt of court. And the restriction is even worse with my friend Wes McKinley, who was the foreman of the special federal grand jury.
Pardon, I'm out of my league here, but if there is a grand jury looking into Rocky Flats, does that mean a public official cannot speak about, since we don't know what the grand jury is looking into in Rocky Flats, does that mean that the governor must, and the congressman must be silent on an issue in there? It's a violation of that grand jury, which again has a proceeding or a set of topics that can't be known. So does it silence any public official from speaking?
Well, I mean, I think,
help me,
Patty, that the question is how do you know something? If you know it because you were privy to grand jury proceedings, then you're covered by the mandate to keep those proceedings confidential. To the best of my knowledge of whether or not the incinerator had been improperly operated did not come from any information that had been presented to the grand jury, or it was independent of that. Reminds me of the sort of the conundrum of being on the Intelligence Committee, where you would go to a briefing and learn something that was top secret that you'd also read in the New York Times that morning. I mean, so how do you know it?
It's also improper or illegal for somebody that's involved in the grand jury or got grand jury information to disseminate it and characterize it. And in this case, it was mischaracterized, and that's from outside the grand jury investigative work that I can say that.
I am at some point going to try to orient us towards a cheerful, what have we learned and what can we think of in the future with these dilemmas? And in fact, David, in our email correspondence, did raise that larger context of the many places in the United States in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s where, maybe winding down a little in the 1970s, but 1950s and 1960s where industrial development was all out, no regulations for most of the environmental issues. And so surely there must be something that people can draw from these episodes to say what is appropriate caution in the future. I'm getting, in this case, I'm getting very snarled in the, if secrecy was the problem, or one of the problems, and we do have a panel at 1 o'clock on secrecy and you'll be on that, then how can restricting public officials who are concerned, who speak to their citizens, doesn't that just further the burden of secrecy? Or I'm trying to defend their right to speak, but I'm not doing it.
I'm not feeling threatened, Patty, so.
Well, good.
But I think that this is a sort of a systemic issue for advanced technological societies that we are. How do we get a handle on these issues of unintended consequences, in this case in the form of public health and environmental degradation, in advance of the implementation of the technology that causes them? How do it's sort of, it's almost existential. I think we're now facing that, if you will, and you're the expert on the panel on this, on the fracking issue. Do we understand exactly what the implications are of implementing that technology in sufficient depth, no pun intended, to make good decisions about whether the costs outweigh the benefits or the other way around. Certainly, before it took America, and we were, I think, largely at the lead in this internationally, it took us until the 70s to come to terms with this, and the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act and RCRA and CERCLA and all of that were gradual processes by which the political institutions of the country were sufficiently pummeled by the science that we knew we needed to do something about it. But in the meantime, you had a generation or two of contamination happening that we weren't smart enough to figure out ahead of time.
Well,
Go ahead.
okay, we'll go in order. Go ahead.
If you can,
Yes, ma'am.
I just trying to get on the question of what can we get out of this? What can we learn from this? We obviously look back, and as I read about the fires, prior to this time, scares me to death about those of you who are working out there, particularly in the fire forces, dealing with putting water on plutonium. There are so many lessons we can learn from this. But I'm trying to translate it into the world that we're in now. And one of the things we need to learn is government secrecy. When is it necessary? How do we deal with it? How do we respect it? When do we break down the wall and get to it? The NSA, on the phones is one piece of it. Just this week's news of the release of Sergeant, what's his name? Bergdahl, about it not telling the Senate. My gut is the President of the United States, whether Republican or Democrat, in intense negotiation like that, can't be talking to everybody in the world about it. You just got to have some delegation of privacy. Now let me give you another one. That's the drones. I'm a former officer in the Air Force. I understand dropping bomb from a B-29 or something, but when you're targeting through a drone on a single individual and you're about to kill him, that's a sniper to me. That's just a sniper. And the guys who are doing this are back in some plains of Texas at a console directing all this and making a judgment. They got certain rules, how many civilians are around. And look, I'm not anti using drones. We got to move, but how we use them is, I don't want to live in a country where I got a drone outside my window, staring in and seeing what book I'm reading. So there is some balance we have to arrive at between necessary privacy or secrecy in government and a periodic check on it. Like you were checking other governmental agencies that were being overly secret about things they shouldn't be. Well, I just think that one of the learnings from Lockheed Frats is how do we not only be safe for the environment, but how do we be honest with each other about what's happening here?
Getting back to Rocky Flats, there's a procedure manual that's called Multi-Agency Radiation Survey and Site Investigation Manual, and it stands for MARSOM. So when you think about the accelerated experiment at Rocky Flats that began in 1996, I don't know how to characterize the remediation, but there was a contract let and a lot of money was supposedly saved. But there were really two contracts, and the second contract was after MARSOM was implemented. And I keep feeling there's a tone here that if a federal agency were to really help its citizens and follow the rules and not try to find ways to hire contractors and attorneys to beat the rules, I think we'd be a lot further ahead. And where I would like to go with this is that the MARSOM investigation, which is a procedure that the Oak Ridge Institute of Science and Education implemented, and they found problems out at Rocky Flats. The 771 and 774 complex, that sounds familiar, the building 707 and the 903 Lip area. And these things were brought up to the DOE, and the DOE, which is interesting, it's two different parts of DOE, and the contractor balked. They didn't, because they had an agreement in writing they weren't going to accept the independent verifications of these problems. And so nothing could be done. So the contractor got the extra $100 million, and you know, we're living with the issues that the Marsom investigation found. And to me, that's what's germane about Rocky Flats, is that we're constantly fighting our own government. There's no reason why the health department in the 80s they were delegated authority in 1984 over RCRA, and I just don't understand and what it takes for the Department of Energy to, number one, deal with a court case and fight amongst themselves. I mean, when you look at Rocky Flats as well, not just what the governor said about Cecil Andrus, but the Nevada test site stopped taking waste from Rocky Flats, in part because they were mischaracterized waste and they weren't randomly sampled as required. What that means is they cooked the books, and the Nevada test site a few years later reported that they were hit with a $20,000 fine from the state of Nevada, which is, you know, it's still money, but the state of Nevada said they could have fined the Department of Energy $1 million because of all the Rocky Flats waste that were mischaracterized. That's the extent of the problem. It's not just Classified Information and Procedures Act, it's the suspending the Constitution, and we're better than everybody else. If it's exclusive jurisdiction of the state of Colorado to do something, then I think the government needs to acquiesce, and that's how I feel about it. Thank you.
I have well, I'm sorry, I'm trying to suppress this comment, but I started college in 1968, and I still have stored in the mind certain stereotypes and attitudes, and the notion of a former FBI agent speaking for transparency and openness is just, it's a little bit of a cosmic moment for me as I look back at my... Okay, so the stereotypes,
Well,
they don't work out, but...
Yeah, I'm somewhat of a whistleblower. I cooperated with the Ambush Grand Jury book with Karen Balcony and Wes McKinley. It's while I was working. I took a risk to do that, losing my job. I testified in the property suit in 2005, and even Judge Kane was worried about, my freedom, basically. And Kirkland and Ellis was hired by DOE, only the most expensive and the best attorneys. And they fought very, very hard to keep me from being able to testify in that case. And but the transparency aspect of it is, I worked with Colleen Raleigh, and she brought up the Moussaoui problem after 9/11. I mean, she went through the same kind of hell, so to speak. Sorry for my French, but she did. You have no idea. You have to be melancholy sometimes to get promoted in government, and it's very hard to get rid of anybody. And I always laugh about the National Security Division of the FBI was written up in the U.S. News and World Report in 1998 as the Latte Division, and there was a reason for it. That's why I didn't work that kind of stuff. And so Colleen did what people should do that are fighting the system, and you're inside the system, is go public, go to Congress and go public, and keep yourself in the, and that's my best advice is if you feel like something's wrong and no one will listen, then go public and go to Congress, because Congress will get it done. Might not be fast enough, but my hat's off to Congressman Howard Wolpe, who's deceased now, and his staff for bringing forward the Rocky Flats prosecution inquiry that was reported in January of 1993. And the bottom line of that report was that the Justice Department bargained away the truth about Rocky Flats. And they did.
So, where I was going with this is actually to raise the question. I mean, it seems like so much of this story is about the tangle of the federal bureaucracy. And the state is kind of a bit player in this tale of agencies that are not in communication with each other, or in hostile communication, or in...
Well, actually, if I may, when I first was involved with environmental crimes investigations, and I worked with an EPA agent, our first search warrant was in January of 1985. And a health department official was invited to come along. Now, there's some logistics involved. We have to get the federal judge to agree to have an outsider be present with us during a search. And I got dressed down by this health department official. Why are you doing a criminal investigation? Why is the FBI here? You know, all these questions. And this is not the way to do things. You know, we need to pursue it civilly. And my response to that person was, you mean like Love Canal? I know this predated the environmental laws, and thank goodness for Rachel Carson and Silent Spring. But Elizabeth City, Cleveland, I mean, it took years to mitigate those things. My explanation was, let's do it criminally. Let's make the company clean it up. Let's make the company pay a fine if applicable, and let's save taxpayer money. And the case in January of 1985 ended up to be a $200,000 fine. The company paid for the cleanup, zero cost to the taxpayer, and it was done in 6 months. And I had several other cases, another one off the South Platte, huge case in this country, the first knowing endangerment under the Resource Conservation Recovery Act convictions. And the company paid a fine, they cleaned up their own property, it cost nothing to the taxpayers, and the 3 people that were contaminated with VOCs, or volatile organic compounds, received $1 million for the medical treatment that they needed. And I don't know what happened. We didn't stay in contact, but it's costing no money to do it to the taxpayer. Now, Rocky Flats was completely different. And one thing I'll say about the U.S. Attorney's Office, we were able to get Rockwell to pay the money and not ask for reimbursement, even though they were entitled to by contract with the government. But as far as, if I may, I'm on a roll. The Rocky Flats Stewardship Council is a great idea. And I don't know if Councilman Tim Plass and Councilman Bob Briggs here. There you go, right up there. Talk to them about it. That's who needs to control the Stewardship Council that's really only funded for about 60 years. We're talking a 250,000 per year constituent like plutonium-239, and DOE's only willing to fund it for about 60 years. But you know, go thank them. Thank anybody that's on the Stewardship Council, because they're going to hold DOE to the fire. They need to be. Actually, if you're going to ask my opinion, they can leave and leave their money. And it should just be a county, state, and local stewardship council. That's who's interested in it. That's the neighbors. That's who's affected by it. And you have to get involved in these type of things. That's the solution to the problem. In 1982, the Nuclear Waste Act was passed. We still don't have a repository. And the debacle down in Carlsbad with the waste isolation pilot plant in February until about now, we had nowhere to put it. And we lived in, my wife and I, Patricia, lived in California, and we had the San Onofre nuclear power plant. Now that it's closed, now what are people saying? Where are we going to put the waste? There's nowhere to put it. So that's part of the problem about Rocky Flats. Things were imploded and buried because that's where it has to stay. That's not the answer.
Yes, please, both.
Well, I'm trying to pick up on this point about how much power a state has in reference to the federal government. And as a people, we have to just assume that there are certain levels of government that have to handle certain things. The United States government has got to make the decision about how many military bases we have. Leave it to the states, it's always the economic issue. You follow? You got to delegate that. Then you got to have transparency enough that you know what happens, and you got to have some means to hold that federal bureaucracy accountable. Then the state has got a set of things that we delegate to them. Control of oil and gas wells is a very interesting issue. Yes. Because in my judgment, you can't have each individual city designing the drilling requirements, you may have the city determine setback, but there's a technology in regulating oil and gas that probably has got to be statewide, but there may be other things that can be local. What I'm saying is you got to decide what level of government you're going to assign the responsibility. Then, as people, because they're all our governments, it's got to be transparent enough that we know what happens, and then we got to have mechanisms to correct it. And it's the transparency that's scaring a lot of us on a lot of things, particularly on how many people are listening to our telephones. So we just got to continue to work at this. I'll give you one example of the inability of this nation to find a depository for nuclear waste. You know, the rods from the plants. That's tragic. I mean, everybody's saying not in my backyard. Somebody has got to take the responsibility in this country and saying, if we want to use nuclear energy, we have to have a disposal site, and it shall be there. You know, you got to do that as a people. And so as I think about Rocky Flats in Colorado, and as my role as governor, I had a responsibility for the safety of the citizens, and but yet I didn't have the responsibility for running that plant, but yet they intermix, and so we have to find ways that we work together on that.
Just, if you don't mind.
No,
Can I-
actually, I'm
Okay.
moving towards audience participation, so we're
Yeah.
in brevity mode now.
Then a couple of quick things. One thing that didn't make my bio in the program or with Patty is I'm now on something called the Public Interest Declassification Board, a U.S. government entity that is attempting valiantly to do what that title sounds like. But the point is, one, we are in danger of losing a handle on our national history because of the volume of classified information that is building up. But more importantly, to look at, try to remember what it was like there in the middle, or now we know the waning days of the Cold War, where the existence of the nation was invoked by the national security establishment as the rationale for things like Rocky Flats. And to question that was a very problematic undertaking. You know, we sort of tiptoed up to that, chipped away at it, sometimes got brave and really went at it, and we experienced that again after 9/11. I mean, the Patriot Act was another seizure of concern about, you know, an existential threat to the country that brushed aside, as John would put it, some of the Constitution. So it is endemic, I think, in the nature of a political society in moments of crisis to give up a little bit on the transparency stuff in the name of security. We need to be ever vigilant about that, and historians in particular need to be adamant that we not classify our history. Second, shorter point, I think I might have heard John indicate something commendatory about James Watkins, Admiral retired, then Secretary of Energy. I just, not to speak ill of the deceased, I never encountered a high government official more contemptuous of the United States Congress and its oversight role in dealing with the business of the department than Admiral Watkins, who once was quoted to me famously anyway as saying, "Damn Skaggs, he's using my own investigation to cause me to suck eggs."
Could I add to that? This is just a personal reference, but it reminded me in this conversation. Watkins was out here early on in his term doing a press conference in one of the suburban towns, and I was in the circle behind him, and I was very competitive with the federal government, but it was just being terribly cut up by the press in that press conference because he didn't know the local scene. And I was so embarrassed for him, I went up and took the mic from Admiral Watkins deliberately to divert the questions to me, to give him some time to, quote, get his act together. Yeah, it was just an act of it was my opponent, there, but I couldn't afford to see him being dumb in a situation in which he was not informed. So I took the heat for a moment or two and then turned back to him. He came to me afterwards and said, "Hey, thanks for rescuing me." I mean, I was his opponent, and he was an interesting guy.
Okay, I think, I actually did want to say a little bit more about the context of the 1980s, and you did that. So speaking of brevity, that worked out for me, so now I don't have to go to that. So we are now ready to shift to audience questions. And again, given how remarkable it is to have these three together, if you could be very brief in asking the question, that would be very cool. So, yeah, there you go.
Would you agree that it is not a matter of national security to get at?
Okay, so, sorry, are we going to have, the mic is here now. So now, I'm sorry, I should have said that. A good moderator would have said that, would have said.
Would you agree that it would not be a matter of national security to explore where the approximately 1.5 tons of plutonium at the Rocky Flats area might be, and how we, given that we only spent about 1/10 of what scientists said would cost to actually clean up that area, that we explore how we can further mitigate the toxic waste in that area, and the advisability of building a parkway and a park through an area that was declared by scientists to be contaminated with toxic waste.
Sounds like a question for the governor to me.
Well, one of the questions I had during this panel, I left before a lot of that cleanup occurred, and I don't know the status of the science that says on that. But if I were now having to make those decisions and somebody proposed a road across Rocky Flats, I would do the same, increased diligence. You don't do that if you're going to disturb atomic waste. You just don't. So it's the facts. I don't know. I just have not been there since the cleanup. I followed the cleanup of the arsenal really, really personally, because we not only had toxic waste, but we had weapons buried, shells. But I left before they cleaned up Rocky Flats. So do you know how what the facts are?
I didn't mean to be too
No.
flip in giving you the hot potato, Governor. I don't know the characterization of the remaining plutonium residues and contamination at the plant site. So is it conceivable that there are some areas that are so concentrated that it could actually be susceptible to some kind of terrorist use, if known exactly where there was I don't know, so it's hard for me to say whether there's any kind of legitimate security issue pertaining to some place or places. On the question of further cleanup, I'm, as we are, I think, in a lot of these questions of highly technical dimensions to big public policy questions, I don't know how clean is clean enough there, and what alternative expenditures of funds in the cause of public health gets us more public health benefit than getting at another nanocurie per cubic whatever in the soil at Rocky Flats. Is that the best use of public funds, or is more money for the National Institutes of Health to explore Alzheimer's, which gets us more benefit as a country? Clearly, because we're proximate to Rocky Flats, we have an understandable emotional bias toward that being a best use of funds. But I think it needs to be a compared to what question, not an absolute matter.
Well, if I could interject, I'll make it quick, because I know there's a lot of hands. But as I said earlier, in April of 1996, the DOE manager put a moratorium on the destruction of documents. I think we need to find out what that meant And the third quarter Rocky Flats Stewardship Council report, maybe it's a DOE report about during the storm, you know, the September storm. I'm really confused about what it says in there, but to get pointed about it is apparently there's a new SEEP out there called SEEP, SEEP 995, and it's got a little bit of a hiccup with plutonium, supposedly 239, and americium, which is not good stuff. And so where's that coming from? Why weren't samples taken by the DOE, but the health department was able to take some? And I'm just glad it's called SEEP 995 and not the sewage treatment plant, because DOE always wanted you to understand that the sewage treatment plant out there was sanitary, when it was sanitary, industrial, hazardous, and radioactive materials that went through it. And it was spray irrigated on the east spray fields as well as the west. And McKay knows that because his family sued for the west spray field. So if all those constituents were spray irrigated all the time, all parts of the year, then how contaminated is it, and what sense does it make to implement the right-of-way provision of the Rocky Flats Wildlife Refuge Act that allows 300 feet east of or west of Indiana to help facilitate a parkway? It makes no sense to me. And why the government, the DOE, ignores those facts, I don't know. Maybe I should move back and in the spirit of Frederick Douglass, agitate, agitate, agitate.
So, did you have your hand up? Yeah. Did you have your hand up? Yes. Yeah. So this is an athletic event for these people with microphones in this. So if you could go there, and then I think there was somebody up towards the middle. You might go into the middle aisle because I think that's where the next one's going to be. Okay.
In the interest of transparency and democracy, how can we get the records unsealed from the grand jury?
Well, I think only a federal district judge can entertain that question. And as I understand it, federal district judges have entertained it and rejected it. I don't pretend to know what goes on in their rationale for doing so.
Is it okay to ask you, David, about your own feelings about that?
Well, yes, perhaps this falls into the category that the governor alluded to in his opening, that there are some decisions that perhaps we're not entirely comfortable with that we made at the time. But at the time, I was allied with Mike Norton against the efforts by John Dingell in the Congress to make the grand jury proceedings public because of my legal training, believing that there were larger policy issues involved in maintaining the rules of grand jury secrecy that if we were to make this exception, you know, it's the old slippery slope argument about making the first dent. So that was the position I took, as I say, ironically allied with my 1986 election opponent, Mike Norton, who was then U.S. Attorney. You know, at this point, do I think there is a legitimate public interest in having access to the grand jury reports? I do. Do I think there's also a legitimate public policy question about disclosure of secret grand jury proceedings? I do, and that's why I think judges are in the best position to be the arbiter of those competing interests.
Okay, there was someone sort of in that middle area there.
Behind you, sir.
Oh, there. Oh, yes, there's that person. Okay.
Yeah, I want to thank you guys for doing this because real Rocky Flats information is really hard to come by. I've been here for 20 years, and this is a real first, so thank you. I have a question about culpability. We certainly know more about atomic energy and how it affects people now than we did in 1952. So between 1952 and the time the plant closed, was there a time when our knowledge of what was happening came to the point where the DOE and they became culpable for what was going on? In fact, they knew they were killing people, and yet they did it anyway. Or was that the way it was from day one?
Want me to go
Well,
first?
I don't know the answer.
I'm trying to understand the question. When did the public actually start to find out about Rocky Flats?
I think I have
The
it.
question is, at what point would it have been known that the practices at Rocky Flats were actually going to lead to the death of the people who worked there? Would that have been 1952?
No.
Or was that something that came along later?
No, it was the heroic efforts of Ed Martell and his group. After the '69 fire, Martell asked the Atomic Energy Commission to sample the areas around the plant to see what kind of dangers loomed.
Okay, so it was in
And
1969 when
fire.
we really knew.
Well,
And then
no.
it took until 1993 to get it
No, it was
closed.
only after the Atomic Energy Commission denied the request, so Martell and his crew went out and took their own samples, wrote a report, and in, I think, January of 1970, provided them to the AEC, and they were caught with their pants down again. And all this long time, they had a PR machine. You know, everything's just fine, but now they had to answer to the elevated contamination by the plutonium-239 that was adopted by another scientist that the AEC accepted, and the isopleths are very iconic about where the contamination left the plant and what the sample results showed. And that was the thawing of the AEC's PR machine to have to start acknowledging what was happening at the plant. And, you know, right after that, about that same time frame, Harvey Nichols gave them a report that they didn't want to hear about little plutonium particles in the snow and how it contaminates. And then you have the Lamb-Worth report of 1975, which is an interesting study. It shouldn't have been discounted, and it should have been taken seriously, because now most of the recommendations in that, 40-year-old document have come true. Rocky Flats had to have its operations transferred. Now, the workers don't get free medical care, as the Lamb-Worth report, recommended, and they're playing catch-up on the system right now to get compensation that they deserve. They were lied to. I mean,
I just wanted to say, I think there's a very deep zone of mystery in this, that the stories from the Nevada test site where soldiers without any protective gear were just sent to run to ground zero. So the notion that you would be using nuclear weapons in conventional warfare, and so the soldiers had to advance on ground zero. So they're just out there in uniforms. And AEC people were out there in gear, in protective gear. And so what is that? What is that? Why are the soldiers doing that? There's something there that is, I think, just a deep mystery of what is going on in the cognition of people who do a test at Nevada test site and send those soldiers. My friend Jack Leffler played the trumpet for the charge when they would, okay, so there's some zones of, I mean, it's like you're reading a very bad novelist's work on that stuff. That just doesn't make any sense. What could be going on there? But I also think that what we need, and I may have colleagues who are doing this, the study of health physics, the thing called health physics, which is a weird name of what is it that you do if you are an officer with some kind of charge of public health for people at Hanford. I knew the health physics guy there. It's a discipline that historians need to study and the question is really your question, what were they thinking? But I don't think it's a simple answer. It wasn't like, oh, we're killing people, but we're okay with that because we're getting paid. It's not that. It's not that. It's something much more complicated.
The culpability issue, I think that, if I can presume to narrow your point just a little bit, sir, is not when did people know that they were doing things that were dangerous, because I think they knew that pretty early on. They weren't sure of the extent of the danger, but it was rationalized against the purpose of the activity. But in my mind, criminal culpability kicks in when unnecessary risks are being taken that you knew you could have mitigated, but were undertaken blithely or without proper precaution when you knew you could have done better. And so by way of contrast, as a society, we undertake lots of public infrastructure activities that predictably are going to cause injuries to workers and death. Building bridges, highways, dams, there is, an algorithm or a calculation that you know that those are going to involve dangerous activities. We do them because of a sense of a greater public benefit. We mine coal knowing that that's an inherently dangerous activity. I wish we didn't do it, but you know. So there's lots of stuff that we do that we don't attach criminal culpability to, even though we are witting of its dangers.
Why did the Department of Energy conduct experiments in Hanford with releasing nuclear reactor material in the area of the Tri-City area to see what would happen and simulate it against the Soviet attack? Why did the Department of Energy and its predecessors conduct experiments on prisoners and putting plutonium in them that was finally released by an Albuquerque newspaper? And why are we being subjected to the experiment at Rocky Flats right now for this accelerated experiment? Because it's a cookie cutter process that's going to be applied to all of the nuclear weapons complex facilities. It does, I mean, if that's in the interest of national security, then I think it needs to be rethought.
So, I'm trying to help the microphone people with the plan. Oh, you're okay? You're okay? Okay. Then, in the orange shirt over here.
Linking what happened 25 years ago with today, and what the EPA first kind of brought into public discussion, would you live in a house at Candela's?
That what?
The nearest development?
Say what Candelas is.
Candela's is the nearest development to Rocky Flats. Would you live there, and why or why not?
Well, you know, look, when I live in a particular house, I wouldn't live in a place that I thought was going to be unsafe for my children. But unsafe is a relative term. You got to define it. As I listen to this, I grew up on a farm in the 1930s, and it's the most dangerous thing in the world, you know, to work around that equipment. I used to work in a country elevator without any mask at all. I had a bandana across my nose. You follow? Because we all did it. Now that's stupid now, but there's a balance, and I think that we need to be vigilant. I would summarize it: we need to be very careful about what we do to expose ourselves or others in a workplace or in homes. We got to rely on our government to help protect us, and it's got to be transparent. And we got to have the whistleblower is a necessary thing, and we need to have avenues in which government can correct. Let me tell you, in my private life, I'm a John Deere dealer. So if I want to go to a store and visit it, I never go in the front door, because if I do, the manager grabs me and he shows me what I want to see. If I go in the rear door, I see the guy who is an old scrubby mechanic, and he says, Romer, this place is really screwed up. You know what I mean? And he'll tell me what he thinks is really happening. And so you've got to have government have a way of testing itself and not let the bureaucracy abuse the power of not protecting people.
Exactly.
Okay, so where's the microphone? So there he is. Okay, so that the lady who actually has two. Oh no, I'm sorry. I'm confusing. Oh, I'm going to wear my distance glasses from now on. I am so sorry. Excuse me for that remark. Sorry, I apologize for that.
There's actually two people.
Yes, I see that now. As soon as you stand up, it's all clear. I will wear distance glasses when moderating. I will do that. I'm sorry.
Thank you for your comments, John. It's great. And Roy and David, thank you for being here. I have two issues that I'm concerned about. First of all, with the implosion and the burying of very highly hazardous materials at the site proper, the shallow groundwater table, I think in 1994, was estimated with a 500-year flood, redistributed a curie and a half of plutonium in the area. In September, we had a lot more torrential water coming up and out, pushing that contamination again. Where are the current aerial gamma surveys to show us where is the contamination now, and how did they get approval to build a place like Candelas on the south buffer zone of the facility? It defies imagination and logic that anybody would want to be right next to an active Circula site and with the resuspension of the plutonium in the area, how can we have accountable government when they are moving forward with what seems to be unwise and unhealthy development in an area that is still not truly stable?
Can we get to a question?
Yes. The site is not stable. Where's the data? Where's the aerial gamma surveys? And where's the sampling during these events that are redistributing material?
Okay, thank you.
And
This way, I guess I'm going to suggest that this may not be the people who know the answer.
yeah, I was going to say, I
To
think
those.
the Department of Energy needs to be continuing to do that kind of monitoring, and the Jefferson County Planning Office presumably approved the subdivision, on the basis of which, or Arvada did, I don't know the jurisdiction.
Down here, Philip. And then we'll go back. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit prejudiced towards this side, and I'm going to.
No, I just want to mention that there are two panels on Sunday that will be addressing these issues with people who are who should be very knowledgeable about the issue. So I would suggest that these questions are better, if you can come on Sunday, better addressed on Sunday, because we do have some. I'm quite confident the questions will be asked. So thank you.
Okay, so Harvey, if it could be very quick, because I do want to get a couple more questions, and I know that you have things to. Just a second.
Okay. Harvey Nichols, since John has been
Yes,
kindly
please.
referred to my work. Just briefly, the snowfall study, it might just seem hard to explain, but basically I was capturing in real time the snow that was scavenging out plutonium particles, tiny particles that were coming out of the filters at the plant. And what I've implied, based on real microscopic evidence, is that the entire site was dusted with tiny quantities of very small particles in the size range suitable for inhalation. The entire site, and running up to figures by my estimates of tens of billions of plutonium particles per acre laid down over the lifetime of the plant. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Harvey. Okay, so over on this side, and I guess just directly next to you there.
Do you have moral qualms about the agreement that was struck with Rockwell, that they would pay a financial settlement, whereas there were grand jury decidings that seemed to indicate that officials within Rockwell were culpable, that it was more than, oh, gee whiz, we goofed and we're malfeasant. No, there was criminal activity involved. And it was, as I recollect, attorney Mike Norton, who sided more with Rockwell so that they could get off the hook just paying out money, rather than ever admitting criminal activity. Do all three of you have problems with that resolve?
Yes.
Yes, I did have a problem, and when Congress investigated that situation, and it was well known that I believe that individuals were culpable by the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Department of Justice made a decision, conscious decision, that I was not going to testify, and they didn't allow me to go to Congress. And in turn, Howard Wolpe's subcommittee then subpoenaed me. And then the department said I wasn't going to go, Department of Justice. And then I got a letter from Congressman Wolpe that I would be in contempt of Congress if I didn't show up on a certain day. And at the last minute, I then went to the Department of Justice and had a conference, and it was suggested to me in no uncertain terms, as it was a gentleman's conversation, so to speak, but the rebuke would come later if I didn't. That was intended, that if I didn't toe the company line, like the EPA agents and the attorneys from the Department of Justice and U.S. Attorney's Office, we had to go in unified. And of course, Mike Norton testified that we were all unified with the decision, and the Department of Justice made it very difficult for me to testify by constraining what I could talk about. Some of it was unrealistic. It finally thawed, but I had to have a handler with me. If you ever see any footage, like out at the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center of me on the video. That's Roger Cubbage. He was with the legal advice, and he was a good guy, but he was there to make sure. But I testified the way it happened. I didn't take the opinion of the department, toe the line of the Department of Justice. I didn't contradict my own reports like some people did. So no, I don't. I have a huge problem with that. And all I will say is that the report came out early January, and by the end of the month, I had my ticket to go to LA.
There's a modern counterpart of that unfolding daily on the banking, international banking. We're constantly putting $20 billion fines and making the decision not to prosecute. So you need to prosecute in order to make a barrier toward future action.
The woman who I ignored at first, when I had my vision problem, you had your hand up, and I interfered there. So, okay, now let's make up for that. Okay.
I actually was rereading some of the Wolpe Commission findings, and I was shocked at how many times they made you, they shut you up. And I remember when, what is it, Edith Holman and Bob Roach were at my sister's place with a bunch of whistleblowers. And I had to say, I'm very happy with the way it turned out. However, I was shocked sitting in court when they came down with the findings for Rocky Flats. My question is, since we have not been able to count on the Health Department or the EPA to save our bacon, what on earth can we do now that the horse is already out of the barn? The blue line where the Health Department used to say, do not build beyond, is it 92nd?
No, 128 to 72.
128 to 72. Sims to 93. What on earth can we do to stop that short of burning the barn down? How can we stop development in an area that has hot spots and skip zones? We absolutely wonder why we cannot get aerial gamma surveys of our community to see where those hot spots are. Why can't we get some cooperation?
Well, last Monday, I was at the Rocky Flats Stewardship Council meeting with several other interested citizens, and it could have, there's more empty chairs, or there's empty chairs that should be filled, and you got to support Councilman Bob Briggs for one thing, and task DOE to do their job and to do it right.
Well, we gave up.
I'm gonna get, oh, okay, sorry, I'm gonna get one more question before we go to our closing reflections. So in the back there, about the fourth row from the back. Yeah, that would be you, there. And here comes the mic, here comes the mic.
As a resident of Arvada during the '57 fire, a lot of my classmates have had various forms of cancer or tumors. So my question is, one, can we do some kind of statistics on the people who lived here during the period when this contamination was taking place, using computers and all the modern things that we have today to find out what kind of cancers, one. Two, the second thing I'd like to see is how can we help them through the CDC or other government entities, ways of curing or helping people survive the tumors and cancers that are resulting from Rocky Flats. I don't expect any monetary compensation, but why can't the CDC, if it can work on bird flu, why can't it work on cures for people who are exposed to radiation, whether it's Hanford or Rocky Flats or any of those? So maybe a little more positive spin? Thank you.
Well, I think John referred earlier to Carl Johnson, who my fuzzy memory is that Dr. Johnson undertook the kind of epidemiological study that you're suggesting would be appropriate currently, and did it back in the 70s to start with. I think the science there has advanced markedly in the intervening 40 years to be able to do a much better job than he was able to do, if my memory serves me, as head of the Jefferson County Department of Health. But bear in mind that what you get as a final product from that kind of study is correlation, not cause. And at some point, correlation is appropriately interpreted as cause, but let's have realistic expectations about what we would learn from that kind of study.
I would just have to say that on behalf of public health scholars, they end up with numbers, they end up with probabilities. They really cannot do much to say this person has impact. And it's understandable why that is a constraint of public health scholars, but I am so glad I am not in the field of public health, because what an expectation, appropriate, very understandable and appropriate expectation, but methods, people won't stay in one place for 40 or 50 years. They won't get medical records. So anyway, it's a complicated thing. And Lynn, no. Okay, so we are now going to have, sorry to move it along here, but I want to make sure that we get a couple of minutes of closing reflections from our people here. And let's, by all means, I'm sorry, I don't mean to shut down the possibility of a public health study having value, but it's going to be a difficult matter of interpretation that comes out of that. So, okay, so should we reverse our alphabetical order? So, Lipsky.
Thank you, Patty. I invite you to look at the Colorado Constitution, and it's more than an invitation to the federal government to move in. It's basically a tacit approval whenever the government wants to move in, except one thing, Pinyon Canyon. That one has to go through some extra hoops for the federal government. But Rocky Flats was started because probably that provision in the Constitution existed. So now you've got a Rocky Flats post-closure. And I spoke in front of a committee on the Hill here, at the state capitol in 2010. And it was a simple idea by a cowboy from Walsh, Colorado. He was a representative for y'all. And all he wanted to do was put a bill through for informed consent. You know, like on your honey that says you don't want to give honey to a child under 1 year old, those types of things. And where that comes from is that under the Rocky Flats agreement, the Department of Energy has to put signage, you might have seen it last week, or Sunday in the Post, that it says U.S. government, no trespassing, and that's it. That's all it says around the Superfund site that's inside the wildlife refuge. And Wes wanted to have signage in front of the refuge that just warned people about what historically was there. And kind of like when you go horseback riding, you know, it's informed consent, you take the risk on your own. And after we spoke, quite a few of us, one of the people from, representatives said that he was from Colorado Springs. He says, you know, this is really too complicated to vote on right now, and we can't vote on it. Now, the government has to put a sign up there. How does the contaminants know to honor that sign? And do you really believe that if there's full public access, that we're not going to have people testing those signs and going over the fence? And then what's going to happen? I mean, I was around firearms all the time. Think about it. You go out and shoot, you target practice, and then you come home and you traipse all that gunpowder and barium and antimony all over your house. It's toxic. So how are we going to know? So it's just simple things like that, you know, the solution's not far from our grasp. You know, we have a lot of laws, and we have too many laws, but there's enough laws that if we just worked in unison, we can get through this. And maybe make it cheap enough, not cheap enough, but you know, be frugal with our money. There's not a lot of it. And again, I'm going to press to, you know, thank a Rocky Flats worker for making us safe during the deterrent years. They're unsung heroes, and now there's a law that says they should be compensated, and I think we should all do what we can, whether it's just a pat on the back, Jerry and Jeff out front with the signage or whatever. maybe you have an expertise that can help them. Thank you.
Governor.
In regard to safety going forward, I think there's enough science that can give us accurate answers as to whether that site is safe or unsafe or how close you can live to it. I'm sure that there's science that can help us do that. We ought to make that available to government officials so we can cure that problem. The only other comment I want to make is this discussion sure points out how important it is to have intelligent people in government and honest people in government. Intelligence and honest. And ultimately, we got to trust them. And the thing that worries me about the limit on getting intelligent and honest people in government is the amount of money that is now involved in the electoral process. And I just, I want to return to that period of time where we choose people not because, I mean, these television ads on all sides are just driving me nuts because it's not just, it's wrong, but we're making Americans addicted to channel television that is bleeding our minds of the truth. I worry about it.
Well, it's a wonderful time to spend a Saturday morning sort of reliving and being reminded of the difficulties of a most vexing issue I had to struggle with as your congressman. If Patty will excuse me for practicing history without a license, I do think this is an example of the lesson that we learn over and over again about being skeptical of the invocation of the national security rationale for doing things. It is legitimate much of the time, but not all of the time, and we need to be smart enough to figure out when we're being snookered into doing things that we needn't necessarily do in the name of national security. I did not call Mark Udall on the evening in which he won election to the 2nd Congressional District to tell Mark, now Rocky Flats is yours, because it's all of ours, and you know, I will continue to bear responsibility, credit, guilt, pride, whatever, in the various decisions that I had to make. I would just close by echoing what Jon said, to honor the men and women who worked at the plant, who undertook the risks, sometimes knowingly, which makes it even more worthy of our regard, sometimes in the dark themselves, about what the nation was asking them to do. And we need to make good our obligations to them as fully as we possibly can, even if it's as late as it now is.
Well, yes, all of you. I want to end with my gratitude for having the privilege of taking the role I've had this morning. Grateful to the Arvada Center for putting together this really remarkable weekend of activities. So I want to thank them. I want to be really clear about saying that the crucial national resource, whatever national security or national interest means, the crucial national resource is an engaged citizenry. And it is most excellent to sit here and see you embody that necessary bedrock of the nation, the engaged citizenry. So thank you very much for your company and time, audience. And please make sure that you let me know any concerns you have about the session or any omissions or clarifications or whatever I should attend to. And then I would like to thank these speakers who have been reflective and self-examining and forthright in a way that for a historian is a remarkable experience, but I think is also that for a citizen. So I speak as a citizen and saying thank you.